back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. One of the hugest political stories of recent memory was the election of Lula to the presidency of Brazil, returning to that post after a period of political exile, of framing, of prison, of everything else. An incredible comeback story. A couple other leftist governments in Latin America are also have either taken power recently, meaning 2019 in Argentina, and most recently in Ecuador as well. And something is up there, perhaps. Our next guest will let us know. Ben Norton is a journalist based in Latin America. He is the editor of Geopolitical Economy Report, which can be found at geopoliticaleconomy.com, and he has been writing about, among other things, not only the Latin American left, but efforts there to attain some independence from U.S., what I would call U.S. financial hegemony. So without any further ado, Ben Norton, welcome back to the program.
It's always a pleasure being here. Thanks for having me, RJ.
Great to have you. Let's start with this. Am I right or wrong in sensing, obviously elections are close and multiple factors are at work, but my bias is, first of all, that when a leftist anywhere gets elected, they've succeeded against strong headwinds. It's not a balanced contest to begin with. Am I right in sensing that there is a resurgence or potential resurgence of the left generally in Latin America, or am I projecting too much onto recent events?
No, it's certainly true that the left has been on the rise in Latin America. In fact, for the first time in modern history, the sixth most populous countries in Latin America have left-wing governments, or at least they did until December. There was a coup in Peru, which we can talk about today, which has been very bloody. Over 60 protesters have been killed. But excluding Peru, the other five most populous countries in Latin America all have left-wing governments. And you mentioned Brazil, but also a very historic development is the first ever left-wing president in Colombia. Colombia had never had a left-wing president. Now it has Gustavo Petro, who's a very interesting leader. He was a former guerrilla, a revolutionary guerrilla, and then he became mayor of the capital, Bogota, and is now president. And I have to say, he has exceeded my expectations. He's been very impressive, not only in terms of his domestic policy, but as a voice in the international stage, pushing for peace, environmental protections, opposing openly the war on drugs. In fact, Gustavo Petro, in his United Nations General Assembly address in 2022, he gave one of the most powerful speeches out of all of the leaders in the world. And I watched and listened to many of those speeches, and I have to say, Petro's was one of the most impressive. And what we also now see is with the resurgence of the left in Brazil, which is the largest, most populous country in Latin America, we see a big move toward regional integration politically and economically, which is very important because going back to the 1960s, the 1966 US-backed coup against Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Nkrumah had been talking about the concept of neo-colonialism, the new era of colonialism. And Nkrumah pointed out that many of the countries in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that got independence formally from European colonialism were still subject to economic neo-colonialism. They were not able to exercise complete economic independence. And what we now see across Latin America and the Caribbean is a realization by many of these leaders that they need to have economic independence from U.S. financial hegemony. That's the term you use, and I think it's the perfect term. And they do that through increasing their bilateral trade and also by creating a new currency. And this is, for me, the most exciting and interesting thing that we've seen emerge in the past few weeks in Latin America is that President Lula, when he was campaigning in May of 2022, at a rally, he promised that if he became president, he was going to create a new Latin American currency for bilateral trade called the Sur, which means south in Spanish, and it's Sul with an S, which means south in Portuguese, very similar. And he hasn't wasted any time. He came in office on January 1st, and And 3 weeks later, he announced, and the Argentine government announced, that they're already doing research and making plans to create a new currency. So there are a lot of very exciting things happening in the region. And it's because the left has been able to come to power in most of the countries in the region. The only exceptions are Uruguay and Ecuador.
And I want to talk. I want to talk very much about the sort of pan Latin American potential of something like the super currency, but I also want to, to make sure our audience has a better, clear understanding, as many of them already do, I think, of, first of all, the history there, and then some of the countries involved. The U.S. for 60, 70 years now has acted as if it has a given right to military and economic dominance of Latin America, has not hesitated to intervene and overthrow governments in Chile and Argentina and elsewhere, Ecuador, everywhere, has been not a positive force there, I would say, as trained torturers at the School for the Americas. Yeah, I mean, we could go on and on, but that's the gist. So it's against this backdrop. We've seen a democratically elected government like that of Allende in Chile overthrown with U.S. backing and so on. So we have now, you mentioned 6 countries, well, 5, now that there's been an overthrow in Peru, but we have 6 countries that elected left governments. And I think that's significant. I also think it's worth mentioning, the fact that my sense is that what it means to be left and a left leader in Latin America is somewhat different than what we take to mean the left in the United States. And I don't just mean, the Democratic Party, which gets called left, but I mean, even in the sense, different from Bernie, well, perhaps Bernie Sanders would be the same way, I don't know, but very different in the sense of some of the creative thinking you've already described. And I know that Lula has named Amazon defenders, indigenous people who have fought to defend the Amazon, as to the environmental ministerial posts. So if I've got that correctly. And so we have not only a nascent left, but we have a left that's thinking in what I would call, in the best sense, radical new terms about how to look to the future. That's my impression, but you follow it much more closely.
Yeah, absolutely. And when it comes to social issues, certainly leaders like Petro in Colombia and Lula in Brazil, and also Alberto Fernandez, the president of Argentina, and his vice president, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, they have all implemented a lot of socially progressive policies, emphasizing the importance of indigenous rights, which is a very important issue in the region. Of course, in countries like Bolivia and Peru, the majority of the population is indigenous. And in Bolivia, after the revolutionary process started by former President Evo Morales and continued now by his successor, Luis Arce, we see that the country has been recreated essentially as a plurinational state in which indigenous nations are recognized as part of the constitution. There's multiple languages. And so those are all important policies. But what's also even more important are the economic policies, because, socially progressive policies are possible in the United States. What's not possible within the, bourgeois political system are economically progressive policies.
Right.
Bernie Sanders is seen as this crazy radical, whereas in terms of Latin American leftist economic policy, it's to the left of Bernie Sanders. So let's look at Lula, for instance. I mean, Lula is not the most, and of all the leftist leaders, he's not the most left wing, but he is very radical in a lot of ways. So for instance, in Brazil, Brazil has state-owned companies, Brazil has state-owned banks, and under Lula, he's trying to revitalize all of those. And basically, he's trying to bring back this kind of mixed economic model that's known as import substitution industrialization. This used to be the model of many of the kind of left-wing nationalist governments in the non-aligned movement, especially in Latin America. In fact, Brazil was one of the creators of the ISI model, import substitution industrialization. What that basically says is that the neoliberal model is based on exports, and it's specifically based on low value added exports of raw materials. So if you're a poor country in the global south and you have oil, you have gas, you have copper, you have agricultural products, basically the neoliberal Chicago boys, they tell you that the best way is to open up your economy to foreign capital, let it be, penetrated by all these foreign corporations who want to invest in all these different sectors, and they get taken over. And then you simply export all of your materials, and that's how you're going to develop yourself. No economy ever in history developed itself through that model. In fact, all of the economies, all of the rich developed economies developed themselves, well, many of them through imperialism, but also through protectionism. The US and Britain were the most protectionist economies in history. The Korean economist Ha-Joon Chang has written about this. He has a really good book. It's called Kicking Away the Ladder. And he talks about how all these economies became wealthy through protectionism, including South Korea, including Japan. So that's what Brazil is doing. Instead of simply exporting iron ore, Brazil is a major exporter of iron. Instead of just simply exporting oil, Brazil is creating its own industries, and it's doing it with state sponsorship through state-backed loans, through state subsidies, and even in some cases through state ownership of these companies. So he's not a socialist. Lula's not, he's not Fidel Castro. He's not going to expropriate all of the wealth of the rich, bourgeoisie, but he is very much challenging neoliberalism directly with his economic policies. In Colombia, we see something very similar. I wouldn't say it's as radical, but Gustavo Petro is also talking about the importance of developing Colombian industry. He's also challenging the reliance on the export of oil and coal, because in Colombia, over half of the exports are fossil fuels, specifically oil and coal, and it's basically a petro state. People probably know that in Venezuela, over 90% of the exports are oil, but Colombia also very much is a petro state. And Petro is trying to industrialize the country, create new economic opportunities, and specifically around renewable energy and sustainable agriculture and those kinds of technologies. So, the Latin American left is very serious about creating economic alternatives to neoliberalism. They say that openly. And in fact, if we look at, I mentioned the United Nations General Assembly speech that Petro gave, he criticized capitalism in that speech, but we can also look at another very impressive speech that was given by a new leftist leader in Honduras. She's the president, Samara Castro, the first ever female president. And she's very, very revolutionary. And she, in her speech, also in her UN speech, condemned capitalism and said that we in Latin America are building alternatives to neoliberalism. She also just gave a speech at the meeting of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, the CELAC, which was held this week in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And in that speech, she said that we in Latin America need to join forces in order to build socialism. So they're talking about the S word. They're talking about socialism and doing it across borders. It's a very radical project.
And I think this is important to talk about for several reasons, Ben. One is, first of all, the left in many parts in this country in particular seems demoralized, discouraged, thinks there are no positive developments taking place. And it's important to see positive developments. I think that's good globally for people to understand, see that's happening. I also think it's important for Americans to understand why we've been a force against progress in many cases in this country. Bolivia, well, if we, a lot of people who run this country think, well, if we can't get the lithium from Bolivia to power our drones, it's a national security threat. If we can't get the fossil fuels from Colombia, if we can't get the iron ore from, you get the idea. So, but now we see this shift. And one of the developments that fascinates me a lot is that the world financial order, dominated by the dollar, dominated by multinational financial interests, but U.S. led and so on. There is now a concerted movement against that, which is part of what you've been writing about, because we seem to have a monopoly for a long time. We, in the broadest sense of U.S. and related institutions, IMF and so on, to make loans, to make grants to developing countries, and therefore to dictate terms, our terms, and people are. And I'm not, idealizing anybody in this, but we have competitors now. Fernandez, you're right, in Argentina has gone to China and Russia. I imagine China, being a much likelier prospect for loans and aid, joined the Belt and Road Initiative and so on. And now we have the Sur, which you mentioned, and the idea of seems to be leading towards a European Union. It seems to me the long-term goal, obviously just starting out, is to reduce the reliance on the dollar and create a kind of currency and I don't know what we'd call a trade zone or something for Latin America, as Europe has done, as Africa has discussed doing. Is that basically right?
Yes and no.
Okay.
I'll start with the comparison to a trade bloc. A very good similarity would be ASEAN, ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. They have a very similar kind of economic bloc for trade, and it's really helped those countries develop each other, right? Because if you're just simply exporting raw materials to the imperial core, to a wealthy country like the US, you're not going to develop. But if you're working with other countries in the global south that are trying to develop, you can help meet each other's mutual needs and develop each other's respective economy. In Southeast Asia, they've been quite successful at that. Countries, like Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Latin America is definitely looking at ASEAN as a potential influence. So in that sense, you're right. But in one way, I want to push back against what you said,
Sure.
Which is the comparison to the European Union. This is a very significant distinction. The people overseeing the kind of planning for this new currency, the Sur, have been clear it's not going to be like the euro. And there are a few significant differences. I'll explain. So the Eurozone is based on countries that use the euro as their national domestic currency. That means that these countries cannot have monetary sovereignty. That is a big deal because it means that large economies that are based on exports, like Germany, have a huge advantage over smaller economies that are based on imports, especially a country like Greece. This is why Greece has been trapped in basically permanent austerity and neoliberalism, because even if the Greek people voted for a revolutionary socialist movement, they actually did that, which was Syriza, they can't actually implement any of the economic policies they want because they have to use the euro as their domestic currency. The only way they could implement those policies is by creating a new national currency. And because the Eurozone was designed by neoliberal economists, it says that every country in the Eurozone is legally mandated that their government cannot spend more than 3% of GDP as deficit. So in order to fund a lot of these programs, infrastructure projects, even sometimes things like healthcare, education, you often have to deficit spend in the government. But, as MMT economists has often pointed out, that's not necessarily a bad thing because a government's budget is not like a household budget. Like if you're a household and you're running a deficit, obviously it's going to be a problem. But if you're a government and you run a deficit in your own currency, it doesn't really matter to an extent. There's going to be some inflation, but a little bit of inflation is not a problem. A lot is, but a little bit's not a problem. If that currency is owed to the government, it can never go bankrupt, right? Like if Greece has its own domestic currency, it can't go bankrupt in debt that it owes in its own currency. It can go bankrupt if it owes debt in dollars or euros in a currency that it cannot print. So in Latin America, the economists who are helping to plan this, who are leftists, they're studying clearly these examples around the world, like in Southeast Asia, like in Europe, and they know they should not replicate the Eurozone model. So there's an Ecuadorian economist named Andrés Arauz, who was the leftist presidential candidate in the 2021 elections, and he came close to winning, but he was defeated actually by a right-wing banker who's the current president of Ecuador, Guillermo Lasso. But anyway, this economist, Andrés Arauz, he has written a blueprint that was for Lula. And in the blueprint, he talks about the ideas for the Sur, and he talks about the creation of a new central bank of the South and all these plans. And he says very clearly, this is not the Eurozone model. It is a unit of account. And that means that the countries that use the Sur as their currency, they will not use that in their domestic transactions. It is strictly a unit of account for international trade, but each country will still maintain their domestic currency. So that means that local countries can maintain their own monetary sovereign policy. And it also means that large countries like Brazil are not going to have a huge advantage over much smaller countries like, Honduras or Nicaragua. So it's a much better design model that allows countries to have their own economic sovereignty. And it's actually based on the same model that was proposed by John Maynard Keynes, the famous British economist, at the Bretton Woods conference in 1944. But what happened, this is the conference that was held toward the end of World War II. Right. That was the conference that created the IMF and the World Bank and established the US dollar as the global reserve currency. But there were a lot of people who were against the US dollar being the reserve currency. And John Maynard Keynes, who was an advisor to the British Treasury at that conference, he advocated for something he called the Bancor. And the Bancor would not belong to any country. It would be an international unit of exchange that would be used for international transactions. So if countries wanted to do trade, they would do trade in the Bancor. That means that it would not give the so-called exorbitant privilege to one country, specifically the United States. The French finance minister complained that the U.S. had an exorbitant privilege because the U.S. dollar was the global reserve currency, and only the U.S. can create more dollars. So this system in Latin America is what the world should have adopted at the end of World War II, because it doesn't give preferential treatment to just one country. And it's also similar to the model, by the way, that the BRICS bloc is developing as we speak. They're also trying to create a unit of account, an international currency that is based on what it's backed by is a basket of currencies of the different members, right? So obviously, if you want a currency, you have to back it by something. It could be gold, it could be a mineral, it could be oil, in the case of Saudi Arabia, or it could be a basket of different currencies. So that's what BRICS is working on now. And Brazil, under Lula, was one of the co-founders of the BRICS bloc. And Argentina, by the way, has applied to join the BRICS. So while Latin America is making this currency, they're also working with BRICS, which is also developing its own currency.
And that raises a lot of interesting questions, Ben Norton, including if they have to back it with something tangible, an asset, then you've gotten away from the era of fiat currency like the dollar, which we can just declare that there are more dollars, which itself is an interesting development. Of course, but you're saying domestically governments can still do that. You mentioned MMT. MMT teaches that or posits that inflation happens. I mean, there's a misunderstanding about that people in MMT think there's no such thing as inflation, but that it's driven by resource shortages rather than sort of arbitrary shortages of fiat currency. And even if you're not an MMTer, the idea that a government can't invest in its own future, that it can't choose to borrow above a certain amount to educate its children, to develop its resources, to build an industrial base, whatever it might be, which even in the old model might be a wise long-term decision. It basically, a government is not autonomous with that ability. So it sounds like individual national autonomy is very much a part of this plan.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, it's a plan that's being designed by leftists. I mean, it's completely different from the Eurozone. It's actually useful to compare and contrast. I mean, the Eurozone was designed by neoliberal economists following the orthodoxy of neoclassical economics about, comparative advantage and all of that. No, I mean, in Latin America, it's a model that's being designed based on how these countries can develop their economies. And I mentioned, Brazil, I mentioned Ecuador, but another key player in this is Bolivia. And Bolivia should be, I think, really a model for so many people around the world. What Bolivia has been able to accomplish economically is really incredible. And it began under the president Evo Morales of the Movement Towards Socialism Party. And what he did is he said, we have all these natural resources, and what we're doing now, what we've done for decades or centuries, is simply just export these raw materials with no really industrial development. So what we should do is nationalize our natural resources, invest heavily in local industry and local production, and then encourage, labor unions and labor federations, and become a self-sustaining economy. Bolivia has had massive economic growth since Evo Morales came to power. In fact, GDP per capita tripled under Evo Morales. That is to say that the size of the economy divided by the number of people tripled under Evo Morales. And lithium belongs to the state. And lithium is, of course, it's been referred to as the white gold. It's extremely important for the creation of renewable energy, for batteries in, our cars and or in electric cars, but also in our phones and our computers and all of that. But also, it was part of a larger project. So Bolivia has state-owned glass companies. It has state-owned agricultural companies. Like, it really does have this, I think, pioneering model. And Bolivia has actually, by the way, one of the world's lowest rates of inflation. And under Evo Morales, this economic model was overseen by Evo's economic minister, Luis Arce, and he's now president. So Bolivia is also involved in helping to think about how they can do this. And there are a lot of really brilliant minds in Latin America involved. And, RJ, you also mentioned another really interesting thing about this, which is how, in Latin America, they're studying all these other examples of what happened around the world, and they're studying MMT and all of this. And they, I think, have created a kind of new generation of economic analysis, of economic views of how to develop your economy. Rafael Correa, the former president of Ecuador, he referred to it as socialism of the 21st century. And it's not there's a lot of people who talk about some kind of crisis, the Soviet Union was overthrown, and, you had the Deng reforms in China, and people are, for instance, Slavoj Žižek talks about the importance of all this. We need new theories, but Latin America is developing what they call socialism in the 21st century. And I think a lot of people around the world can benefit from studying these different models. They are reaping the actual fruit of these projects. And I mentioned Rafael Correa. These people are also trained economists, many of them. Correa had a PhD in economics. He studied under Joseph Stiglitz. He was more radical than Joseph Stiglitz, but these in Latin America, there often is, I'm not accusing you of this, of course, but in general, in the financial press and a lot of US political analysts, there's this kind of condescending racism toward people in Latin America, as if, they're all just these populists who don't know how to do anything. But these are very serious intellectuals who I think have really developed a new way of economic development that I think people around the world, especially in the global South, can look at and learn from.
Well, I haven't been to Latin America for quite a long time, but the countries I visited had a very active intellectual community in a way that this country does not. For example, people were taking ideas seriously and thinking about them many years ago and now. I guess so. Two questions come to mind. One of them is, but it's almost answers itself, I'm afraid, but is why don't we hear more about this? This is why I really appreciate what you're doing at Geopolitical Economy Report. But why don't we hear more about this? Because this is a conversation with history in a way that we should be observing, listening to, taking part of. It's an experiment. It's a look into the future that we never hear anything about, because even people on the economic left, I think, in many parts of the world, I think you're right, there's a certain soft racism against Latin America. It's just this undifferentiated mass of darker skinned people or whatever. I think racism is a factor, but I also think that there's a kind of doom and gloom. There's a kind of, they'd rather talk along with that, so they focus on Europe and how Mélenchon in France is not getting it done, or this or that. There's a defeatism where there should be optimism. Do you get what I'm driving at?
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets at a very deep Eurocentrism in parts of the left. And, I see this as constructive criticism. Excuse me, there are a lot of great left-wing parties and groups in the US and Canada and Europe who are doing good work, but they still often do have this very Eurocentric worldview. And in Latin America, I mean, there are so many very interesting things happening all across the region. And I think we can learn so much from these different models. And in terms of, you mentioned MMT. So MMT is popular in certain parts of the Latin American left. And some of these countries have implemented some of these policies. It's not just theoretical. The thing about Venezuela that's often thrown out is people say, well, Venezuela failed. Well, the economic situation in Venezuela, the crisis, is very easy to explain. For 100 years, Venezuela was a petrostate. Well before Hugo Chavez was born, Venezuela was a petrostate. And when Hugo Chavez came to power through democratic elections in 1999, over 95% of Venezuela's exports were petroleum products, and also, to a lesser extent, minerals. So extractive industries. And he nationalized those, and he used those natural resources to fund social programs, and there was massive economic growth and a decrease in inequality and all of that. And then the U.S. imposed sanctions and a blockade that prevented the country from exporting its oil and other natural resources. And according to the United Nations top expert in sanctions, Alina Duhan, the Venezuelan government lost 99% of revenue because it was a petrostate, and it still is a petrostate.
Right.
So that's not because socialism failed. It's because sanctions prevented the government from exporting its oil, from which it got 95% of export revenue. So it's very easy to explain. But I mean,
go ahead.
Yeah, but Venezuela is no longer like the basket case that people love to point to. It's actually recovering quite rapidly. Yes, it still has issues with inflation, but inflation is much more under control. Ironically, it's actually Argentina that has worse inflation now than Venezuela. And even Credit Suisse, which is a Swiss bank, estimated that Venezuela's economy is growing at 12 to 20% GDP per year. So, I mean, this region is recovering a lot, and they're doing it in a lot of very interesting economic ways. You mentioned the possibility of getting off fiat currency. I just wanted to point out that that's actually not real. I'm not accusing you of saying that that's what they're going to try to do, but that's not at all. I mean, a lot of these countries, they're exploring with different models, but no one is talking about going to like a hard currency backed by like gold or a commodity. They understand the importance of having freely floating fiat currencies, being able to fund government deficits and all of that. But what we're also seeing is that a way to maintain currency stability is by not backing it directly by pegging it to the price of oil or iron or something like that, or gas, but having a currency that basically can be backed by a commodity. And that's exactly what Argentina has been trying to do. Argentina does
a currency. Let me just interrupt you for a second. Yeah. A currency specifically for the purpose of international trade that's backed by a resource. That was my understanding of what you said. So that Argentina, for example, would participate in that for international trade, but would still be free. This was my understanding of what you said, but would still be free to issue its own fiat currency at home. Yeah, well, we still don't know yet. There's discussions going on because they're still in the early stages of planning what the currency would be. They did say that it would be an international unit of exchange that would not be a domestic currency, but so it could be backed by a commodity like oil or like gold or something. There have been discussions in the BRICS of making the international currency backed by a basket of different commodities. So not just oil, right, but also maybe like oil, gold, wheat, other things. But anyway, the point is that so another very interesting kind of new economic strategy that we've seen emerge in Latin America is currency swaps. So there's so many things that are happening, interesting experimentation. So China and Argentina, starting with the Kirchners, started doing this strategy of a currency swap, because a huge problem that these countries face is that the debt that they have is denominated in dollars. And this gets back to this idea, right, of like the US dollar hegemony and the exorbitant privilege. So Argentina has $44 billion in debt owed to the IMF. And why is that? It's because the former right-wing president, Mauricio Macri,
he was overseeing this economic disaster, this mass neoliberal policies, and it did not result in economic growth. It actually resulted in an economic crisis. So what happened is he went to the Donald Trump administration and he asked for a loan to try to stabilize the economy before the election. It was clearly a political request for an IMF loan, and the Donald Trump administration pressured the IMF to give this loan to Argentina, and it was over $50 billion, which was the largest IMF loan in history. And so Macri got the loan, and he used $44 billion of it, and it basically all went to fund capital flight. It went to basically fund a temporary stabilization of the Argentine peso. And then because he removed all capital controls in the name of the free market, all of his rich, wealthy friends and donors just converted all of their Argentine pesos into dollars and just stashed it off of in offshore bank accounts. So he basically used all that money to fund to stabilize the peso for long enough to fund capital flight, so rich people wouldn't lose all their wealth that was held in pesos, which, by the way, technically is against the IMF's charter, which says you can't fund capital flight with loans, but he did that. And so then the left-leaning government comes in of President Alberto Fernandez and Vice President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. And they refuse to take the remaining parts of the loan so that they have this $44 billion. So they're stuck with this loan, and then they're stuck with dwindling foreign exchange reserves. They can't really stabilize their currency. Basically, anytime they get dollars, those dollars go into paying not only that debt, but also, they also have a lot of bonds that were sold by Macri, and those bonds were bought up by a bunch of vulture funds in the U.S. These billionaire oligarchs that are trying to suck all of any wealth out of Argentina. And so what happens is that at first this is a problem going back 200 years. Argentina has been trapped in debt, first to the British Empire and since to the U.S. So when Kirchner came in, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, who was a leftist, she decided to try a new strategy, which is currency swaps with China. So Argentina gives China's central bank Argentine pesos, and then China's central bank gives Argentina's central bank Chinese yuan. And then that's a way of encouraging bilateral trade, because then Argentina can buy Chinese products with Chinese yuan. And it's a way of, and then Argentina can sell its agricultural exports to China and get paid in Chinese yuan. So this is a way of trying to de-dollarize and get other forms of currency, and then they can use that to try to stabilize their own currency. So anyway, the point is that's a way of removing the U.S. financial system and the U.S. dollar. And increasingly, that's a way that countries are getting around U.S. sanctions, because if the U.S. imposes sanctions on a country, what that really means is that Iran cannot use the banking system, right? Because the SWIFT system is used in the majority of international trade, and it's dominated by the U.S., and the dollar is used in 80% of international trade. So what Iran can do instead is they can do a currency swap with China, and China can give Iran its yuan, and Iran can give China its currency. That's the kind of thing that we're seeing. It's basically a loan, but it removes the dollar. There's very low interest on it. So, we're seeing so many unique forms of new economic strategies that are being developed. And why does it get no coverage, you asked? Well, obviously, one, because the financial press is only concerned with the very profitable markets, and no one who's interested in making a lot of money is going to profit in Argentina. The only people who are investing in Argentina are these vulture funds, and then they use the U.S. legal system to try to force Argentina to pay them. But the financial press is not really that interested in Latin America, and also because many of these governments are governed by leftists. And if you read a lot of the financial press, they're very dismissive. They're the populists. They don't know what they're doing with their economy, because they're not neoliberals like us.
See, well, right, and I think in the big picture, I see a United States financial system. The more, at this point, it feels as if the more it tries to impose its will using the financial system, the more that financial system empire, whatever you want to call it, erodes. That it's in the long run, it's weakening itself by trying to assert itself, which gives these kinds of stories added, as if they need any added global significance. And I guess, my last thought, we're out of time, but, and it's a big one, having lived through so many horrendous invasions, I'm pleasantly amazed that, the U.S. has not forcibly intervened in some of these places. I'm sure it has, under the table in many, many ways, but, I'm happy to see that we haven't overthrown these governments, at least yet.
Yeah, well, I'll just say that there are a lot of dangers. And I think the situation today is very, very different from the 1950s, 60s, and even 70s. The U.S. no longer, for political reasons, can just simply invade. We saw they tried it in Iraq, and that was a huge disaster for the U.S. It was the end of the attempt by the U.S. to build like this unipolar world. That whole idea of Pax Americana and all of that nonsense, it just, even among Europe, people forget, because Europe's politics has shifted so far to the right since the early 2000s. But France and Germany held a joint press conference with Putin, with Russia, against the Iraq war. Just thinking about how different things are today. But anyway, the point is that the U.S. did so much damage to its political image around the world that especially under a Democrat, they can't do an invasion. Now, if Trump comes back or DeSantis, they might just start invading Latin America. It's a very real possibility, but they're also doing it in much subtler ways. And those are also very dangerous ways. So let's not forget that the U.S. has been deeply involved in many of the more recent coups in Latin America. I'll just name a few. The 2009 military coup in Honduras against the democratically elected president, Manuel Zelaya. The 2012 soft coup against Paraguay's left-wing president, Fernando Lugo. The 2016 political coup against Dilma Rousseff of the Workers' Party. She was the successor to Lula. Right. And in fact, Lula, just this week, he condemned that as a coup d'etat, which is what it was. The Obama Justice Department was deeply involved in that. And then the second part of that coup, the 2018 imprisonment of Lula da Silva in Brazil on fake charges. The Trump administration was deeply involved in that. And the judge who imprisoned Lula just before the elections, which is what handed the victory to Bolsonaro, the judge who imprisoned him is named Sergio Moro. And Sergio Moro, after he did that, he was rewarded by imprisoning Lula. He was rewarded by becoming Bolsonaro's justice minister. And then he and Bolsonaro visited Virginia, and they went to CIA headquarters that was with Trump. And then at the same time, we saw the 2019 coup in Bolivia, a very violent coup. And that was clearly backed by the Trump administration, obviously in many ways, and also the Organization of American States, the OAS. And then we also saw a coup just this December in Peru, which has been very violent and has been backed by the Biden administration. I've been doing a lot of reporting on that. The U.S. ambassador in Peru is a CIA veteran. She worked for the CIA for at least 9 years, according to the resume she sent to the State Department when she was being designated. And, they say there's no such thing as a former CIA agent. She's very likely continuing her work with the CIA under the aegis of the State Department. One day before the coup in Peru, she met with the defense minister. And on the day of the coup, he ordered his soldiers to go against the president, Pedro Castillo, who was then arrested by the military and it was sentenced to 18 months in prison without trial. And then there's also the failed coups. There was the
Venezuela.
The failed violent coups in Venezuela in 2014 and 2017. The insane coup attempt with Juan Guaido in 2019. And Spain, by the way, today is the 26th. Spain yesterday, the 25th, finally recognized the Venezuelan government and sent its ambassador back to Venezuela because they want Venezuela's oil. So 4 years after the US and European Union refused to recognize Maduro, finally that coup, at least for Spain, that coup attempt ended. There was also a violent coup attempt in Nicaragua in 2018. So,
okay. So I was wrong. No,
the U.S. can't. The U.S. is no longer able to. We'll see, but I don't think the U.S. for political reasons can like invade like it did Panama or invade Grenada.
Right.
But they are still backing a lot of coup attempts. And that's why a lot of these countries in the region are concerned. And the last thing I'll say is that the new president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, he acknowledged this in an interview he did. It was a very interesting interview. It was with a right-wing media outlet in Colombia. They're pretty much all right-wing. And he said that the coup in Peru is a warning for all of us. And then the journalist said, are you implying that the coup could also, that they could try to do something similar to you? And he said, yes. And he said, I am a child of the Cold War. I remember the coup against Allende. I remember the violence. I was a guerrilla. And he's saying that if the Latin American oligarchy, it's the way he said it, he used that term oligarchy, if they refuse to allow us to win elections democratically, they're going to force the continent to go back to violence. That's what he said.
Well, and we have no reason to question him, but listen, this is such important stuff, Ben Norton. I really encourage people to track it. They can find your writing at geopoliticaleconomy.com. And, I hope you'll keep us posted on this, because this is, in a very real sense, not just a struggle for Latin America, but a struggle for the future. So thanks for covering it, and thanks for coming on the program.
Yeah, RJ, thanks for having me on and letting me talk about some of these kind of abstruse concepts. But like I said, and like you said, I think they are very relevant and important for everyone.
Absolutely. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and you're listening to The Zero Hour.